The following is a Hoop Ball presentation. Welcome to the Fantasy NBA Today podcast.
By popular demand, a whole show, ladies and gentlemen, a whole show dedicated to head-to-head versus Roto. Draft strategy. What's different? What's the same? The question was posed by Neil Rochlani, a co-host here on Fantasy NBA Today, and the people loved it. It was going to be a mailbag question, but it turned into its own entire episode. Neil, do you see what you've done?
I'm still learning, Dan. What have I done?
What have you done? Nothing. You've actually done. I mean, you've actually opened us up to a really good show topic. But Neil Rochlani, Dan Besbris here on Fantasy NBA Today, your Thursday edition. Hoop-ball.com is, of course, a hoop ball presentation. Neil, what's going on, man? We were talking about the fact that you're not an Arrested Development fan before going on air, and I shed a single tear.
I'm sorry. Yes. Well, I woun't say I'm not into it as much as I guess most people are. I've not seen the whole thing. See, now I'm backpedaling because I don't want to offend all the audience. But yes, I am not a huge fan. I found it comedy a little bit, came wave after wave after wave. And it was hard for me to digest the process. Yeah,
I didn't watch it when it first came out. I saw one episode. It was like the middle of season 2. I was at my wife's house. I think we were dating. It was like very early in our relationship, so it must have been like 2004 or something like that. And I saw one episode. Her whole family watched it together, and I was so confused sitting on the couch. And then I went back. One of my roommates in college a couple years later was a massive Arrested Development fan, and he made me sit down. He just put a DVD in because people watched DVDs back then, and watch it start to finish, and it was fantastic. But the problem I always thought, and then, by the way, we're going to get into the topic of the day, but the problem I always thought was that it seemed like you needed to have watched every previous episode to get the jokes in the newest episode, and that's a hard way to build a following. You get like a cult following that way, but as someone new trying it out, I was just beyond confused and kind of upset by the end of the episode. I didn't get any of these jokes. Why is everybody laughing around me? What's going on right now? But yes, the one thing that is awesome in everything, and I think you and I, Neil, can agree on this, is Carl Weathers. He's a national treasure.
Yes. We were talking about that, and that has stuck in my head forever. And I'm glad you brought it back up because it was like buried there in the recesses of my mind. His line in that movie or in that show. So there were I think there were a lot of did they have a lot of cameos on that show?
Yes, a ton.
That just came in and just killed it.
Yeah, Ron Howard just brought in all of his peeps one by one to do little things on the show. So we're going to segue in now, and the segue is we're about to make you guys a little fantasy stew on this podcast. Neil, you asked the question of the mailbag, what is the difference basically between head-to-head and Roto draft strategies? And so I thought, what better way to discuss it than to get the man who asked the question on the show, and we can dig in, the two of us. I have basically 5, I thought, sort of big overarching things, and then Neil, you said there was sort of a corollary on one of those as well. And we're going to hit on them piece by piece here. But before we do, we got to talk draft guide. The draft guide is available at hoop-ball.com for $13.99. The Brewski 150 is in it October 1st. The price of the draft guide goes up slowly from the day it is released, which happened, I think, about a week and a half ago, until the day the season starts. It just slowly goes up. The sale price is the best the earlier you get it. So get it now before the price goes up any farther. Good people. Get it now because the Brewski 150 is in it on October 1st. It will be in it on October 1st regardless of when you buy the draft guide. So you should get it when it's cheaper. Neil, I think that's a pretty simple concept, right? Get something before the price goes up. If the quality of the thing is going to be the same, wouldn't you rather have it when it's cheaper?
Dan, you make so much sense to
Thank
me.
you.
Yes, you explained it very well.
Yeah. Here, Neil, I'm going to offer you this movie. Would you like to give me $10 for it, or would you like to give me $15 for it? I think I know what your answer is going to be.
$10, please.
Yeah, thank you. So go get the draft guide now. It's $13.99 right now. It was $9.99 or $11.99, I think, and then you could get a coupon code early. We have coupon codes floating around out there. You can go back and listen to the In This League podcast from last week. I did an appearance on that. It was a lot of fun. And we gave out a code to get $2 off the draft guide. So go listen to the ITL guys. Come on back. Get the draft guide with a coupon code. Get the Brewski 150 on October 1. Get all the player profiles right now. And thank us later. And that's all I got on that front. Of course, do take a moment if you could rate and review the podcast. Follow us on Twitter at Ball with Neil. You're still not Orange Ball Neil yet, right?
I have not progressed to another name yet. No,
I can't wait. Nobody gave any good ideas. Where are you guys? Where are you, listeners? I need.
I was thinking about going with Adrian as 14, but that may not.
You're gonna
use new listeners, so maybe not.
You're gonna have to register online if you have that. If you have that handle, I don't think I like that one at all. And also I think Adrian actually had his 13th birthday, so we.
I'm sorry. Yes, I'm.
Or was it 12?
Dave's wrong again.
It might have been 12. Adrian's going to be a bar mitzvah in a year. That's going to be a lot of fun. All right, we're going to talk head-to-head versus Roto draft strategy because I do think that there are a couple schools of thought on this, Neil. And one school of thought is basically you do everything the same regardless, and the other school of thought is you do things pretty differently. I don't feel like there's much of a middle ground on this. Where do you fall on the head-to-head versus Roto, how you're going to draft a team strategically?
Yeah, well, last year was the first year I did head-to-head really intensely. So it was new for me, which is, I guess, one of the reasons I posted the question to you to get your wisdom. For me, last year, I approached it a little differently in that I ended up punting. So that was the big difference. I've never punted in Roto, or not. Once I've learned Roto rotisserie, I learned that punting is you just can't win. And head-to-head, it seemed like it worked for me last year. I know you've talked a lot about not going to a draft punting, and if you have to adjust your team throughout the season, and it looks like punting the category works, then do it. But I am still trying to figure out if that is smart or not. So that's the one thing that I do differently.
Yeah, I'm in agreement with you. I do think that there are differences in how you draft head-to-head versus Roto. Some of it, of course, comes down to the other settings in your fantasy league. Most head-to-head and Roto leagues, they end up playing pretty differently. 30 deep, for instance, the big industry league that I'm in with Brewski and Panda and Eric here from Hoopball, among many other industry pros, it actually almost plays a little bit more like a Roto league. These ultra deep, crazy deep leagues, you just basically want to get guys that are going to perform all season long. You want best player available, because if you get someone who's actually really good, it sort of doesn't matter what they're good at in a league that deep. It's going to help you a lot. But, if you're comparing like a 10-team or a 12-team Roto to a head-to-head draft, getting a player who's a tiny bit better than another player doesn't always necessarily match up with a better team. In Roto, you want to have some measure of success across the board. Like you said, you can't really punt it. I think everybody's heard me ranting and raving about possible punt ideas in Roto. I do think you can get away with it in a head-to-head. There's a way where if you punt a category and you become so strong in the others that your team could withstand an injury per se, and you don't narrow your player pool too much, then it could work out. I'm in an 11-category head-to-head league. I don't know how the hell this happened, and it makes me sick to my stomach every time I look at that league, but it's friends, and I'm not leaving it. You can definitely punt a category in an 11-cat league. There's just so much left you could excel at. So why don't we actually use this to segue into punt possibilities? That's one of the topics that I thought we could cover in how you gauge the two. It sounds like, Neil, you and I agree that you just don't punt in Roto, at least not until partway into the season.
Yeah, it's been my experience in Roto. I typically play a 12-team league, or they're about that size, and when I finish last in a category or second to last in one of the categories, and it's typically 8-cat, I guess 9-cat, it could be a little bit different. It's really hard to finish first. I might be able to finish second or third, but first is almost not happening if I punt a category. And head-to-head, because of the nature of the scoring system, It's totally different than what I found out last year. So I did end up punting free throws, and that worked for me. So yeah, so definitely I would not recommend it in rotisserie, and then head to head. I guess it depends on your team. And you said 11 categories. What are your two other categories, by the way?
Free throws made and field goals made. It's a very volume heavy style of fantasy basketball, and it is disgusting. But I'm in it, and so now I've got to just.
Oh, that goes against your whole nature of not loving points, right?
Yeah.
Aren't those correlated with points?
My head-to-head team in that league looks nothing like any of my other teams in fantasy basketball. It actually makes my job really hard because I do all this research on all these other dudes, and my Roto teams are always pretty dang good. And then I have this weird volume scoring 11 category head-to-head team where like Andrew Wiggins has fantasy value, and it's everything you know is wrong. Does anybody, Neil? Okay, so Arrested Development was a little bit too young for you. Did you ever play Marble Madness for the regular Nintendo?
Oh my God, I have no idea what you're talking about.
Okay, so that reference is a bad one. But just for anybody out there, maybe there's like 2 listeners that have played Marble Madness. There's a level. The second to last level is upside down, and the level just comes up with a message that says, everything you know is wrong. And that's the way I feel every time I boot up my head-to-head league. Everything I know is wrong. But forget that for a minute, because that lends itself to a different discussion. Tell me more about punting free throws. How did that work for you? Did you do that? Did you know you were doing that right at the start of your draft?
I knew pretty early on because I had a late round draft position, and LeBron James was there, so I took him. And I had him before, and I knew because of his volume and free throw percentage in past years, he just was a drag on it. It wasn't like he killed it, but he was a drag enough that it was hard to get. I'd have to really get other players to really boost it up, high volume free throw shooters, or really kind of shade my draft the rest of the way to not lose that category or not be, way below average. So at that point, there were guys that showed up like Drummond and the other main guys. Who am I thinking of? DeAndre Jordan, who were just around later than normal because a lot of people were avoiding them. So they were easier to draft when they came into my queue. So I did at that point make a conscious decision once I got one of those guys, then to go punting free throws.
Interesting. Okay, so this leads me to kind of a follow-up question or follow-up point that'll, I hope, segue into a reasonable question, which is maybe the point here, Neil, is that a guy like LeBron James, if he falls to you at a certain spot, he's a difficult guy to pass up on. And whether it's LeBron James or Ben Simmons, who's even worse, either way, you put yourself in a hole that is difficult to come back from. I feel like maybe that's something that a lot of people sort of don't realize. Maybe I don't even at times, which is at that point, Neil, maybe it's easier to just lean into it the way you did and say, you know what, I got LeBron James. The rest of my draft, I could either focus on all guys that can make free throws, or I can open myself up to everybody and try to steal one of these Drummond, DeAndre Jordan, Clint Capella, Ben Simmons types where, I'm already in the tank. I might as well just go the other way. Is that how your brain sort of, you had like 2 roads diverge and a path diverge in a yellow wood or something like that?
Yeah.
Is that Robert Frost?
You have a lot of references, both high and low brow, that I have no idea. But thank you for trying to
Someone's going to correct me on that one, though. Robert Frost is the poet.
The road that's taken, is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know the poem, but I know I'm supposed to know it. Anyway, let's go back to LeBron James. At that point, LeBron actually had a decent year free throw shooting wise, so it didn't necessarily have to work out that way. But yes, there was 2 directions, and then clearly from the way people were avoiding guys with low free throw percentage, they just were much better values when it came back to me in my turn. So at that point, I went that strategy.
So did you take any of those guys ahead of where you thought they were going to go?
Oh no, no, I let them come to me.
Interesting. Okay, so
yeah, no, I didn't have to reach for them, and like I know you've said, like in some leagues where if you have multiple people punting a certain category, then yes, that becomes where it becomes like almost a bidding war for those guys. But this didn't happen in my draft.
So did you find also, and this feels like one more thing to keep track of, when you decided that you were going to lean into the free throw thing with LeBron, and you saw somebody else take, well, let me ask you this first. Who else did you have besides LeBron that were terrible free throw shooters? What other guys did you have on your team?
I had Ben Simmons.
Okay.
Which I got mid-round, last year. He was an unknown. And then I had one of the big men, which I can't remember, either Drummond or Jordan.
Okay, so when the other big man, or Capella or Drummond or whichever one you didn't have, when that guy got taken, did you make a mental note of which team took them so you could kind of keep an eye and see if they were going to start punting? I feel like you almost have to be aware, because usually it's not more than two. I don't think I've ever been in a league where more than two teams tried to punt free throw percentage, the same category, basically. So it feels like it would behoove you at that point, Neil, to write down, okay, team 7 or whatever, they might be punting. So then you sort of have to watch who they're taking in each round and make sure they're not going to try to snipe the punt guy you were looking at later on. Is that something you had to do, or did you feel pretty confident that most of these guys that were coming off the board were coming off just because that was when they were due to come off?
Well, I'm taking notes right now because, no, I did not do that. But I think that is smart because, like you said, there's one other team doing that. It would very much help me to figure out if they're really doing that as a strategy or just they happen to take him as best player available. So I did not. I didn't even think of that. Normally when I draft, I don't even look at anyone else's roster.
Yeah, I rarely do either. I mean, I don't. Sometimes I might glance over if there's a long, if I'm on a turn or something and I know I've got a half hour before I get another pick in this thing, I might take a look at some of the other teams just to see what's going on. But it's really hard when you're not in a slow draft. If you're in a standard 1 minute or 90-second or 2 minute per pick kind of draft, to take the time to go look at somebody else's team. You're watching all the names come off the board. You're crossing them off your own thing. You're trying to rearrange your queue. But if you are punting, it does seem like it would help to be aware if somebody else was. Because if you're punting and you don't get your guys, then you're way up a creek, right? Like if you had LeBron and Ben Simmons, but you weren't able to get the big man to go along with it or whatever it was, you're in a pretty tight spot there. The other team punting might punt better than you.
Yeah, you might be in a tight spot. I'm trying to think, though. I think there are more and more guys who can't shoot free throws.
There are. It's true. Like Jaylen Brown, he was a guy that would have been much better if you turned free throw shooting off. Even like
Derek Favors.
Yeah, Derek Favors.
I'm talking about guys lower down that aren't considered like the high end, punt guys.
Absolutely. I mean, and then there are guys that are like kind of in between when it comes to that punting thing, where it pulls their value up a little bit. It's not quite as significant, like a Paul Millsap maybe might be an example. He's a guy that's been in that 70 to 75% range, kind of like LeBron, right, where that opens him up to you. Russell Westbrook last year was a disaster at the free throw line. It opens up a higher-end guy like that. It's just, in Roto, though, you just can't take that one. You can't, right? It'll kill you. You got to get a couple points in a category, and if you do it in Roto and you don't do it right, you can basically just take yourself out of the running on day one. I think in head-to-head, if you try to punt and you don't do it perfectly, there's an opportunity to sort of fix it. Like maybe another team got a punt guy by accident. You could probably overpay for him. There's ways to shore your team up. In head-to-head, man, or in Roto, I should say, you've got to be really good at the other categories to overcome a 1. Because you're probably not going to be great at the other 9. Punting free throws, Neil, that doesn't make you good at the other 8 categories. It makes you good at like 3 or 4 of the other 8, which is much better suited to, say, a league where you only need to win 5 out of the 9 categories. Does that all make sense?
Oh, yeah. I mean, if someone gets Drummond on their team and they're not punting, or they have Drummond on their team in general and you don't, it's going to be hard to beat them in rebounds, right?
Yeah, and that's what you're shooting for.
You have to make a concerted effort to really beat them in rebounds. I mean, I'm not saying it's impossible, but they're at a huge advantage at that point, So, yes, if you punt a category and it's not guaranteed that the other ones are going to be good. So it makes your strategy limited and your player pool much more limited, and also just how you draft has to be much more strategic.
So I would think that if we were going to put a rule down or a couple of rules at the end of the punt part of this discussion, it would be don't do it in Roto unless you get to like January and you realize you're second from the bottom in something. So you can make a trade. This is what I did with points. I've told this story a few times, but I'll tell the brief version again here. I was second to the bottom in points, and it just sort of happened organically. I drafted a team that didn't score very well. The guys that I thought would had down seasons. So I just gave up on the one dude on my team. I had like one guy on my club that I thought was putting up some pretty good scoring numbers. He did some other things as well, but I packaged him, and I turned him into guys that could rebound, block shots, and improve my field goal percent. And in that situation, I gave up 1 point in points. I could take on the worst scoring players in the league, and I could only lose 1 point in Roto. But I had an opportunity to gain, 1 or 2 in blocks, 1 in rebounds, 1 in field goal percent. So it was like it was a +3. The ROI on that was a +3. I think that's the only situation where you look at it in Roto, where you know you're locked into something probably by accident, and you can turn it into more points. In head-to-head, it feels to me like the rule has to be, if you're going to punt free throw percent, you better be damn sure that you're going to win blocks, field goal percent, and rebounds every week, the entire season. Because otherwise, you've given up an opportunity to maybe win a category for a chance that you maybe win another 3. At least that's how I have it in my head. Give up 1, guarantee yourself 3. Does that seem fair?
Yeah, those was actually the categories you try to dominate. And then, with my draft last year, having LeBron and then Ben Simmons, the assists were just a natural. So that kind of worked out for me.
Yeah, that did work out for you. Have you ever punted anything else? I have. I've punted one other thing, so I can tell
No, I was going to ask you that question. No, I've only punted free throws because that's the most glaring one from the draft prospects.
So in that 11 category league I was talking about, I have punted turnovers, and I've also punted field goal percentage, and I just went for the highest volume chuckers that I could find, because my thought was, if you get a high volume guy in an 11 category league, they're probably going to be terrible at field goal percent and turnovers. I think everybody else is going to be pretty bad at turnovers also, and if you're looking to win turnovers in a league that favors volume scorers like that, you're sort of giving up on like 4 or 5 categories. So in this league, there's field goal percent, field goals, free throw percent, free throws, points, and 3-pointers. You can put 3-pointers in that mix as well. 6 of the 11 categories are based entirely on a ball going into the hoop that was shot by your guy. It doesn't matter what everybody else on the floor is doing. So you could actually give up one of those 5 categories. In this case, for me, it was field goal percent, to be really good at all the others. So it was like James Harden, Russell Westbrook, these types of guys. You take them knowing, by the way, Harden field goal percent has actually, I think, gotten a little bit better over the last couple seasons. But like with Westbrook, you knew you were going to get crushed there. Devin Booker would have been another guy that falls into that mix. Just firing away like it's going out of style, but are awesome at getting to and making free throws, which, by the way, pretty consistent statistical category. Free throws made. Those guys don't usually fluctuate quite as much in that one. They're bombing away from three-point land. They're making a ton of field goals. And those guys do tend to give you things like assists. They trickle in. The other stuff trickles in. They're not bad, per se, in the other categories. And you could get a big guy, too, if you really wanted to. There are big guys that, like Kevin Love, that focus on the outside shot. I've never punted anything else other than turnovers, I think, in a 9-category format. I think that's pretty tough. Free throw and turnovers are sort of the easy ones. And then, like I've said, I've fallen into punting points. Overall, though, I do think, Neil, I think your strategy, so plaudits here, by the way, of taking a guy who you felt was a really good value and then building your team around it is a better way to end up punting something than to go into the draft and, like, round 1, you're doing your round 1, round 2, you're just like, I am targeting Ben Simmons or whatever it is. Because that's, by the way, that's where he's going this year in a lot of drafts. Let's talk about the next thing on the docket here. Head-to-head versus Roto discussion continues here on Fantasy NBA Today, and that is schedule analysis. That's different for head-to-head and Roto. I think that overlooking that is a problem. I think to say that you can just sort of do the same thing regardless is not entirely right. For me, though, Neil, and I think you agree, because I think we may have touched on this briefly before I hit the red button here, playoff schedule is really what it comes down to for the head-to-head side. I had a question, by the way, on yesterday's mailbag show about regular season schedule for head-to-head, and I don't really pay much attention to that.
Regular season head-to-head, yeah, that's interesting. How that would be so hard to analyze, right? Because it's going to vary so much throughout the season. I would think that's almost impossible.
Yeah, the question was actually, I'm curious your thoughts on it. The question came from VP, one of our guys in the forum.
Sure.
It was basically about getting a couple guys on the same team that all have sort of like maybe a bad schedule in December or something like that. And I said, I don't care. I think you can stream. You can do 2 streaming slots for a couple of weeks if you had to. You know, if you had a couple guys on the same team that had a bad schedule. It's the playoffs to me where you really want to avoid those potential down weeks. You want to be nice. You want to have a nice, safe playoff schedule at the very least, and then you could stream if you wanted to boost it. But you don't want any of your superstars to have low game totals in the postseason.
Yeah, so it's all about the postseason for me when you talk about schedule. That's all I think about is looking at getting those teams schedule weeks. But then also you have to go back to your league settings and figure out where your playoff weeks are, which I may have messed up last year in one of my leagues. But
and did you win it
not
anyway?
Not messed up so much as not really even thinking about it, and then realizing, oh, they have a different playoff week than this league. So that and now I am consciously avoiding leagues that have playoffs that go too late in the season because of just how much variance there is in players' minutes in the last couple of weeks. So yeah, knowing when those playoffs are, and then finding out the teams that have how many games each week, and then for me though, it's more unless it's a disastrous week, like if it's 4 games versus 3 games, I'm just not going to like reach for a player because of that. It's more if it's like maybe 4 games versus 2 games, I'll downgrade the guy who's 2 games in my rankings, if that makes sense. But that's really it.
Mm-hmm. I don't know about you. For me, when I look at playoff schedule, I'm looking at rounds 1 and 2 in particular. My league pays. You win money if you make the finals. First place obviously gets more than second place, but so many goofball things can happen before that finals round that there's a little bit of a coin flippy feel to it. Like last year in my head-to-head league, there were probably 4 or 5 superstars that got dropped because they were being rested every other day. And so the team I was playing against just picked him up. He had a totally different team by the time I played him than when his playoffs started. So I wasn't looking too hard at that finals week. I think you really have to focus on getting to the finals. So if you could find guys that go 4-4 in your first and second round of playoffs, provided you do have a 3-round playoff scenario, that's my favorite. I think it's safe to say you should avoid guys that have a 2-game week in the first or second round of your fantasy playoffs. Would you just cross them off your list, Neil? I think I would.
I don't know if I'd cross them off my list, but I would definitely rank them much lower in my rankings. So I'm not a big do not draft guy. So, and I don't have enough experience in head-to-head to know if that is a reason to do it, but I've never done that yet. So we'll see. Maybe I'll get burned and then I'll realize not to do it. But right now, I don't do something like that.
Well,
do you? Is this at all? I don't know. I don't want to throw like another. Well,
no. Please toss it out there.
This question came up to me. Does this at all play into your? So if a guy has 4 games that week and maybe one's a back-to-back, do you worry at all about the teams that are fighting for playoff position versus teams that are out of the playoffs?
Not really.
Okay.
At least on draft day, when you're getting closer to it, then you start to put that in the back of your mind. But you just can't really know. I mean, outside of like the Warriors, who are probably going to be at the top, and a team like the Kings or something that are going to be at the bottom. Although I don't think the Kings even have any veterans anymore. But I think you guys get the drift on that one. Most of the teams sit in some sort of middle bubble where largely guys are going to be playing, and then you just sort of you try to eliminate that last week, like you were saying, Neil. Leagues that go to the end, it gets so nutty. There's almost nothing you can do about it, and it's too much to think about, I believe, on draft day. If you're looking at all of the players and you're trying to eliminate guys that have 2 games and you're trying to figure out which guys might not play down the stretch, you're going to end up panicking and picking some guy you totally didn't mean to have. I think that's what's going to happen there. So you have to simplify things for your brain a little bit, right? You only have 90 seconds to make the pick in most scenarios, so you have to try to make it as easy as possible as you're doing it.
Yeah, that's the one key takeaway from all drafts I can say is go in there with the most simplistic list of players if you can, and not try to have 8 different electronics in front of you trying to figure out what to do as your pick comes up.
Yeah, you got your iPad Velcroed to the wall. You got your big computer monitor in front. You got the laptop out to the side. Yeah, that's too much, man. I don't know. I know there are people that can do it. I can't. I need to be laser focused in on my one, maybe 2 things. I might have my list. Usually it's handwritten, by the way. Usually I have my list handwritten just to the side of the computer, and I'll sort of cross things off and make little footnotes there. Because if I'm switching tabs constantly, then I really lose my focus on the draft. But that's a discussion for another day. We'll have a show, by the way. We'll do a show here on day of draft prep and actual draft. What are we doing to be locked in on that stuff? This is head-to-head versus Roto discussion. We're breaking it all down. Regular season schedule, not really a big key for us. Playoff schedule definitely is. We're both looking at it. I ended up, by the way, with some Minnesota Timberwolves last year that had kind of a crummy, I think it was the first week of my playoffs last season because it was a league that went really late. And so that I had to end up, I basically sold the farm. I dropped a lot of guys I probably shouldn't have dropped to stream the last month and a half of the regular season so that I could guarantee second place in the league instead of third or fourth and get a first-round bye, which I think I would have been pretty confident I would have won my first-round matchup if my Timberwolves were playing 3 or 4 times that week. But I knew I would have lost, so I had no choice. And I think that's why you really have to be cognizant of 2-game weeks for the first and second rounds of your playoff stuff. Let's talk injuries, Neil. That's something that I think everybody's pretty keen on. What's your take on injury analysis, Roto versus head-to-head?
Yeah, so this one is, I think, significant. Not significantly, but there is a big difference because in injuries, so much of it's random, but then you have certain players that tend to miss a certain amount of games each year. And if you know that in Roto, it really doesn't matter where they miss. But in head-to-head, it matters where they miss in terms of time. So, time frame. So guys like, let's say, Kyle Lowry, I think are probably much better for Roto than head-to-head. At least some historical data shows that. He tends to, when he misses games, it tends to be towards the end of the season versus during the season. So the middle of the season. So you have to keep in mind about guys who may miss those, who are injury-prone guys who may miss it at the end of the season.
What do you think about rest stuff? Do you think I think people overblow the concept of rest a little bit?
I'm not worried too much about rest if it's a season that, if your playoffs end at end of March or beginning of April or something like that. But yeah, if it goes towards the end of the regular season, then that would be a huge thing. But yes, if it's a regular normal, we finish our playoffs by March 31st. Then I'm not worried too much about rest because I don't think it really comes down to the last 2 to 3 weeks of the season for those superstar players. Yeah,
they usually play up until that point, right? Most of the rest days happen in April, maybe last day of March. The thing that, the ones that jump out are more the outliers, like the Eric Bledsoe 2 seasons back where they just sat him from the All-Star break. If you end up with one of those guys, I mean, you just kind of have to, give 2 middle fingers to the world and say, damn it, on to the next one. Because those don't happen as often as I think everybody would have you believe. That the full shutdown, high-ranking guys, it's just not that common. It's just not.
Yeah, and even that Bledsoe thing, that was more like a punting. I mean, that was a tanking strategy,
right?
On part of this more than it was. I mean, they said it was injury related, but it seemed more just to be tanking strategy. So that would come down to play. But again, I don't think that comes down until the very last 2 or 3 weeks of the season anyway. So I'm not worried too much on that.
Yep, I agree with you. I think it's hard to guess who's going to be hurt at the end of the season other than Kyle Lowry. He's the one name that jumps out as a guy who always plays himself into an end-of-season injury. My take on injuries is more an early season approach, actually, where with Roto, I am very nervous about taking guys hurt coming into the season because you just don't know how long it's going to take them to get going. I think Devin Booker actually is a good example this year, who magically had surgery out of nowhere. We get this news that he's down. Kawhi Leonard last year was a situation like that where you can have some measure of confidence. Obviously, Kawhi, he just ended up not playing at all. But most of these guys that start the year hurt, they finish the year okay. Most of them. That's good if you're in a head-to-head league. Maybe you can get a guy that slips a little bit because he's hurt, and he's going to give your team a nice boost. In Roto, that terrifies me because injuries can linger, guys can be rusty, it can take them multiple extra weeks to really get their game back in order. Sometimes it just turns into like a weird I'm injured all year kind of season, like Aaron Gordon, who got hurt early in the year and never really quite got back right. Victor Oladipo with the Thunder, he wasn't hurt on day one, but it didn't take very long. Hassan Whiteside, this most recent season, he was hurt by the first, I think he played one full game, and then he was hurt by game 2, and he was never quite right. So in head-to-head, you can sort of deal with that type of stuff, provided they're actually playing the last few games of the year. If you can get them to slip to you. In Roto, Neil, I almost refuse to take guys hurt going into the season unless I'm in a keeper league and I'm hoping to like steal them late and then give up a late pick to hold them the following year. Otherwise, I've found that in Roto, if you start falling behind and playing guys that you don't intend on playing because someone on your team is hurt or playing poorly, you can just set yourself behind the 8 ball the whole year.
Yeah, I completely agree with you on that. They become guys that play. I don't take guys that are injured in Roto that I know are going to be out for a while because A, that could be extended, and B, you don't know. I mean, each game's equal value, so you're losing a lot more value as opposed to, 2 guys this year. So I'm thinking about for head-to-head, late round, like Cousins and Porzingis. They're much more valuable in head-to-head versus Roto. Would you agree with that sentiment?
Absolutely, yeah. If you can weather the half a season where they're literally doing nothing, those are guys you can get late that could turn your team from the 3rd or 4th seed to a top seed in a head-to-head. It could be huge in your fantasy playoffs. Of course, you have to make sure that you can get there, right? If you're in a league where you get to start everybody every week and you've got a dead roster spot for half the year, that can crush you a little bit. You have to weigh these factors. But if you're in a league where you can just stick them on a bench for a while and not worry too much about it, those guys would be amazing. What about the shorter term guys, Neil? What about guys that maybe you're only going to miss? And Booker's the only one that comes to mind right now. But what about guys that are going to miss only a shorter stretch of time? I still don't want them in Roto, and I know that I'm pretty conservative on that particular front. Would you take a guy like Booker as early as he's probably going, knowing the injury situation right now, or do you not really care about that?
No, I probably wouldn't take. Well, he's not someone I typically draft anyway. I think he tends to get overdrafted, but I would not take him mainly because it's he's such a valuable shooter and it's surgery on his hand, so that I'm worried about that whole impact coming back. If it was a different type of injury, I might be more inclined. And I like to see how guys are playing in preseason. Like, for example, another guy like Kawhi, who's apparently very healthy coming into the season, and we're expecting him to be sort of where he was the year before. I want to see him play some preseason games and just like see the eye test, and then I'll be comfortable with it. So when I have no ability to watch a guy in preseason who's a superstar, or one of the higher draft picks in the NBA fantasy draft, I am going to downgrade him at least a few rounds. And then typically I'm not going to get him because someone else will take him.
Yep. So it's not, we've talked about this on the show a lot of times, and I hope people understand that distinction. It's not that we don't like guys, it's that we rank them a certain spot and they're just going to go before they get to us, so we'll never have them. Last 2 topics here, and I think these will be a little bit shorter than the other ones because the injury schedule, punting, these are the big ones for the head-to-head Roto discrepancy. But early round and late round drafting strategy are, I think, the 2 topics, and we can probably roll them into one bigger one. Do you do anything different early and late rounds, head-to-head and Roto? For me, since I've been putting you on the spot here to answer all of these questions first, late rounds for me, head-to-head and Roto are almost exactly the same. I'm still just sort of taking long shots and hoping that things pan out. Early round strategy, basically the same, but with head-to-head, I am crossing off just a couple of guys on an annual basis that have terrible playoff schedules. Other than that, though, it ends up coming out pretty close to the same for me. I guess maybe you could say one other very slight thing is if I get to like the third or fourth round in Roto and I realize I don't have anybody that covers one statistical category, I might try to find a way to get that dude just to kind of round things out a little bit. In head-to-head, you can stockpile, and that's okay because if you're just the best at 6 categories, then you can win your league. In Roto, if you're the best at 6 categories, you're probably going to be terrible at the other 3, and you're going to be middle of the pack. What about you? Any differences early and late round strategy head-to-head in Roto?
Yeah, well, I was hoping you're going to say there was huge differences so I could just take your strategies and apply them this year. But because I don't have a lot of differences in my strategies. I would say the one thing that you brought up is in Roto, I don't know if it's late round because the last few picks in my rotisserie and head-to-head league tend to be guys that I'm either going to start or drop pretty early. I end up like dropping probably the bottom 3 or 4 players on my team.
Yep.
So I'm not looking for, I don't want a low ceiling guy that might be like 120. I want a guy who could get in the top 100. So I'm gonna take flyers on guys in those last few rounds. So
and that's in both types.
In both times. So I'm not looking to round out my team at those picks. I am looking to round out my team though, like in rounds 8, 9, and 10 in Roto, or maybe 8, 9. So it's where we're in head to head. I think I was less concerned about that. So yeah, there might be some like, especially like 3-pointers. I feel like you can get later in an NBA fantasy draft. So if I was short on 3-pointers, wing players that I think are decent but not great, like the Thad Youngs of the world, players like that.
Thank you for that Thad shout out.
Yes, exactly. So that's the one difference. I will look to round it out. Like if I'm missing a point guard, maybe I'll take like a low end point guard in round 9 or something like that.
And that's in Roto or head to head?
That's in rotisserie because I'm much more concerned about positional and being good in every category as opposed to head to head.
Hey, I have one more question for you. Dialing it back to punting here before we end this thing. When I punted field goal percentage, I actually ended up with a team with no centers. Has that ever run? Have you run into that at all as you were building a punt team? Like I got to the last round and I realized, I don't have a center on my team. That's unusual.
Well, let me ask a couple follow-ups for that. Were you allowed to not start a center?
No, I had to pick one up, and it was
okay.
silly. But I rotated him in and out based on sort of what times they had games and stuff. And there were days where like no good centers were going, and I think we have an extra utility slot in this league, so I was able to actually kind of rotate more volume guys in. And the only times it really became an issue was when it was one of those max out days where everybody's playing. And so I had like 4 dudes on my bench that weren't center eligible. So I had to pick somebody up. But now that the schedule is stretched out, that's actually a less of a situation because there just aren't that many days where you have to bench guys on purpose. So it actually worked out okay, but it did cost me late in the fantasy season. There are those days during March Madness where NBA games get sort of clustered a little bit. So yeah, just one thing to be aware of, I guess. It was an early punting season for me, and I just thought, you know what, I'll figure this out as I go. And it wasn't great late in the year, but it was fine for most of the regular season when there wasn't a ton of max out days.
I have not had that issue. I have an issue. It's where like I've had an offline draft and the positions listed in our information did not match the positions eligible in our site that we were using. So I ended up missing out on a position, but that's completely just my stupidity. So.
Yeah. That's why it's good to have a nice piece of scratch paper nearby. That's draft day strategy. Neil, final thoughts on this head-to-head Roto stuff before we put a bow on this thing.
Yeah, well, I want to really look at now schedule analysis for those 2 games as I go into my head-to-head leagues because that is something I did not think about. And then also figuring out how to value like these top end players that are going to come back second half of the season, and where should I take them if I should take them. So that's something I'm thinking about going into my head-to-head leagues.
And that, good friends, is Roto versus head-to-head. Draft Strategy, its own podcast. Mailbag question turned into a whole mailbox. He is Neil Rochlani. I am Dan Besbris. This is Fantasy NBA Today, or Thursday edition. Neil, you and Adrian are wrapping up the week tomorrow. What do you guys have going on? Do we know yet?
I don't think we know yet.
Ooh.
It's a mystery box. It could be a boat.
Mystery show. It could be a boat. Thank you for that Family Guy reference. It could be anything. Neil and Adrian will wrap up the week tomorrow here, and that'll get you through to the weekend, which is freaking crazy, because by the time you hear me on a podcast again, we'll be basically 4 weeks from NBA opening day. Again, go get the draft guide, hoop-ball.com. You'll love it. Get it before the price goes up. Get it, and the B150 shall be yours on October the 1. Should also mention, by the way, there is an early B150 release a la carte on September the 20th for folks that have an early fantasy draft. That is, of course, an additional charge. I would recommend just getting the draft guide, because you'll get the B150 on October 1st, and you don't even have to worry about it, plus everything else that's already in it. At Hoopball Fantasy, we give you updates on things that get added to it. Please rate and review the podcast if you like what you hear. Thanks for the questions, as always. For Neil, I'm Dan. I guess that's it. We'll talk tomorrow.
This has been a Hoop Ball presentation.